The tide had drawn back to reveal a wide, quivering stretch of grey sand, bleached and jagged against the sullen sky. The great house stood rigid and solitary, framed by the wild, bristling landscape, as if awaiting some grand moment that had not yet arrived. Marianne's carriage drew up slowly, the wheels clattering over stones, softened by years of salt and wind. Through the low overcast light, the long lines of the estate's windows seemed watchful, bordered by dark shutters, carefully closed against the encroaching season and its chill. She sat rigidly in the carriage, the leather gloves in her lap tightening her fingers into stately knots of nervous resolve. 26 years, and never quite the place she imagined she might find herself at this juncture. The familiar weight of the small scar at her temple prickled beneath the powdered curls that framed her face, a quiet marker of both folly and resilience. Her hazel eyes, bright in contrast to the dull sky, turned inward, but perhaps not enough to disguise the spark of sharp intelligence behind their steady gaze. It was a landscape that pressed upon one, both confined and infinite in its austerity. Here, at her grandfather's windswept sea estate, she was to spend the often sea alone, beneath the shadow of family burdens no one dared speak of openly. A faint scent of seaweed and damp wood smoke filtered through the carriage window as the footman opened the door. She stepped out onto the uneven front steps, the chill in the air biting at the bare skin of her neck beneath the lace kerchief tied neatly, but not without constraint. Family debts, whispered scandal, and the slow erosion of fortunes. This was the inheritance that awaited Marianne more surely than any ancestral crest or gilt-edged fortune. As she crossed the threshold, the door swung open, wider than she expected. A tall figure stood framed by the glow of the hall's chandelier, eyes darkened beneath brows drawn into a guarded frown, an austere presence that seemed carved from the very granite of the cliffside. Talk had reached her even before this meeting. The Viscount, owner of the adjoining estate, estranged heir, and, by all accounts, a man as unyielding as the unforgiving English coast itself. "Miss Marianne," he said, his voice a low, measured baritone that slipped with the faintest edge of disapproval, "I trust the journey was tolerable, though this time of year is hardly accommodating." Her gaze met his sharp grey eyes, cool but gleaming with a spark of challenge beneath the surface. "Tolerable enough, my lord," she replied, bowing her head briefly, but with an incline of pride. "Quite fitting for this time of reflection, perhaps." He gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. "Reflection has its place, but so does prudence. Given what we have inherited, your presence here is more necessity than choice." She met the glance, willing the faint flush that threatened her cheeks to retreat. "Duty weighs heavily, yes, but so does honour. It is not the same thing." Her tone was carefully measured, though a subtle tremor betrayed the effort it cost her to remain composed. "I have come to honour the estate and its memories, beyond debts and idle whisperings." For a moment, his lips pressed into a thin line, as if about to reject or retort. Instead, he said nothing further, merely turning away with the faintest incline of his chin. There was a paused silence, the tacit acknowledgment of mutual disdain, sharpened by the invisible current of something more complicated beneath. Behind that well-mannered frost, a quiet fascination glimmered, unspoken but undeniable. Marianne's heart thudded unevenly as she watched his retreating figure, the echo of his footsteps mingling with the sighing wind that rattled the window panes. She told herself it was nothing. Disdain was appropriate, she reasoned. Curiosity was dangerous, and yet the ache of expectation lingered, threading through the quiet rooms and empty halls. Days passed with the steady tick of the off-season clock. The household was sparse, servants' voices low and hurried, and the estate felt like a living monument to silence. and secrets too grave to voice. Whispers of the past drifted in every corner, the unspoken scandals, the mounting debts, the prudence demanded by a society quick to condemn and slow to forgive. Then came the evening of the solitary ball, an event as rare and tentative as the first halting crocus after winter, held in the local manor house. It was a gathering whispered about with a mixture of anticipation and reluctance. The room was a blur of candlelight and soft chatter, powdered lace and glinting jewels, the faint rustle of silk like the swell of muted tides beneath the laughter and brimming glasses. Marianne moved among the small circle of relatives and neighbours, her posture impeccably poised, her expression a mask of composed reserve. She had not anticipated the presence of the Viscount tonight, but from across the room his figure emerged, a stark silhouette that seemed to draw the air taut with unspoken tension. His approach was quiet but certain, and when he reached her side, the murmurs began, chaperones nudging one another, distant relatives casting glances coated with thinly veiled curiosity, eyes narrowing in a measuring glance that was all at once assessing and burdened by resignation. "I confess I did not expect to find you braving this isolation. Your grandfather is as defiant as ever, and yet his house stands, despite all," she replied evenly, meeting his gaze with a cool steadiness that belied the flutter of nerves beneath. "As do those who respect its keep." He shifted on his feet, the faintest trace of vulnerability breaking through the austere facade. "I wonder how long defiance can endure. When society places its weight firmly against it," she inclined her head, the dark curls brushing against the high neckline of her gown. "Society can take much into its judgment, but it cannot dictate the strength of conviction." Then her lips curved almost imperceptibly. "I trust, my lord, that you have discovered far more than I have about this place in my absence." His eyes flickered with something close to the faintest mirth, though it faded quickly into shadows. "Though it is the parts unseen that trouble a man most," the words settled between them like a fragile glass, thin and ready to shatter. Around them the murmurs grew, whispers interspersed with cautious glances. The chaperone's eyes sought to unravel the quiet enigma that Marianne so carefully presented, and the Viscount's gaze, though stoic, betrayed a tempest beneath. "I shall take my leave, Miss Marianne," he said at last. The edge in his tone softened into something less sure. "Until we meet again, my lord." As he departed, the trace of his presence hung in the air like a charged sigh. Marianne felt the rhythm of her heart falter, and then steady, a complex beat of defiance and curiosity clenching tightly within her chest. Behind a veil of propriety and whispered societal rules, there were two souls moving slowly toward an uncertain frontier, each guardedly watching, each quietly undone. The Viscount paused at the threshold, hand on the doorframe, the damp breeze tugging at his coat, grey eyes lifted to the ceiling, as if seeking answers beyond the chandelier's glittering crystals. He resolved inwardly, with a slow and steady certainty, to unravel the mystery of the woman who met disdain with enigmatic grace, and why her presence troubled the brittle calm he had so fiercely maintained. It was a beginning, neither of them would admit, but one that marked the first step toward a reckoning bound by duty, desire, and secrets whispered on the edge of the sea. The late afternoon sun had long since dipped below the horizon, leaving Marianne alone in the dim quiet of her chambers. The sea's murmur drifted faintly through the open window, carrying the sharp tang of salt and seaweed, mingling with the faint scent of lavender from the sachets her mother insisted upon. Marianne sat poised at her writing desk, fingers idly tracing the delicate edges of a folded sheet of cream paper she had been meaning to finish responding to, though words had evaded her all day. Then, almost imperceptibly at first, there came a soft sound, barely a whisper, at the foot of her door. Marianne's breath caught as she parted the heavy curtain beside her desk to peer into the shadowed corridor beyond. There slips a narrow envelope, paled ivory and sealed with deep maroon wax. The Viscount's crest delicately stamped upon it. For a moment she hesitated. The envelope felt impossibly heavy in her hand, as though it contained not mere words but the weight of worlds. The seal, crisp, unbroken, summoned her to unravel a secret she was not certain. And yet how could she deny the magnetic pull of curiosity? Her fingers trembling, she broke the wax and unfolded the letter carefully, the paper soft beneath her touch. The smooth ink flowed in precise, elegant script, the very writing itself suffused with a kind of guarded vulnerability that seemed at odds with the Viscount's usual stoicism. "My dearest Miss Marianne," it began, "the solitude of these walls is a prison that none may see, few may understand. I confess with shame the loneliness that gnaws at me, a relentless tide beneath the stoic mask I wear in the eyes of society. Each day, the rigorous dance of propriety suffocates what remains of a freer heart, and I am left with the hollow echo of company that never truly reaches me. Your presence unsettles this fragile order, not because it is unwelcome, but because it is inexplicably true. I find myself plagued by thoughts, unbidden and unwelcome, that perhaps there exists something beyond the gilded cage, something that breathes with the possibility of understanding and of kindness not bound by title. To tell you that your smile, so measured and so enigmatic, has haunted the quiet of my evenings longer than I care to admit. That your silence is a language I find myself desperate to learn, yet I am bound, by duty, by history, by the shadows of a past I dare not reveal, to remain distant. And so I offer you these words confined to paper, a confession I would scarcely dare whisper aloud. Yours, in cautious hope, Evelyn Harcourt. Viscount Langley. Marianne's breath hitched as she laid the delicate sheet back upon the desk. Her heart pounded with a mixture of astonishment and a strange ache. The letter was an intimate unveiling, a glimpse into a soul as burdened and as guarded as her own. Yet, in the quiet chamber of her mind, a fierce war was waged. To respond might betray her position, her family's demands, and the careful solitude she had woven around herself. To remain silent felt both like a wound and a relief. Her hand shook as she lifted a candle from the hearth, its flickering flame casting errant shadows on the walls. With a swift, deliberate motion, she set the letter to the fire, watching the inked edges curl and blacken, smell of smoke drifting up. It felt like a small sacrifice, a renunciation of something she was not yet ready to hold. Yet, even as the last remnants of the Viscount's confession slipped to ash, a quiet certainty settled within her. The letter, though destroyed, had kindled something between them, a secret tether, unspoken but not undone. She traced the ghost of the words in her memory and clenched her fist, fighting to quell the storm of emotions threatening to break free. The days that followed passed in a blur of glinting chandeliers and whispered appointments, the estate consumed once more by the relentless tide of social obligations. The pink hues of dawn gave way to crowds and carriages, the steady pulse of polite conversation and the charged atmosphere of unyielding observation. The grand hall where the season's formal dinner was held smelled of polished wood and roses heavy with perfume. Marianne's gown, a delicate silk of pale emerald trimmed with cream lace, felt heavier than usual, a silken armour she donned for the evening. Her hair was carefully arranged, a cascade of soft curls framing her face, but no amount of artifice could mask the quiet tension that still simmered beneath her composed exterior. She took her seat at the long polished table, a place chosen for its conspicuous remoteness, deliberately positioned between distant cousins, whose names she scarcely recalled, people whose conversations hovered around her like distant tides, neither welcoming nor dismissive, only void. Across the room, the Viscount maintained his habitual composure, the shadow of his melancholy a brittle veneer beneath the mirth of the assembled company. His dark coat gleamed under the crystal chandeliers, the line of his jaw set, lips compressed with the ghosts of his own restraint. Marianne's gaze, drawn across the length of the table despite every effort to appear detached, faltered when it met the Viscount's. His eyes were sharp grey flint against the candlelight, and yet they flickered with an unrest that belied his carefully preserved coldness. Though he spoke to others with practised ease, his attention betrayed him in glances stolen like secrets, in the way his body seemed to lean just imperceptibly in her direction when her back was turned. A turmoil lay beneath the lake of his exterior, a tempest as relentless and hidden as the sea beyond the estate. At one point, the Viscount's manner grew practically formal as a neighbouring gentleman inquired about his hunting expeditions. "My pursuits remain much the same," the Viscount responded, voice measured, though of late the sport holds less fascination. His bleak understatement drew little attention, but Marianne caught the slight flicker of wryness that followed. It was a small fracture in his otherwise impenetrable visage. Between courses, a faint breeze trailed through the open windows, carrying the mingled scents of roast pheasant and blooming night jasmine. Marianne's fingers brushed absently against the fine linen napkin as the distant echoes of the string quartet threaded through the halls. Her thoughts wandered away from the orchestra and the polite conversation that circled like moths, touching on politics, the latest theatre performances, and the suitability of certain matches among the tan, and she found her eyes drawn back repeatedly to the Viscount. Despite his evident effort to mask it, his features betrayed a quiet struggle, a yearning to bridge the distance that society, and perhaps he himself, had erected. She longed to speak to him, to tear down the mask of icy reserve and reach the heart beating just beneath, but the very walls of decorum held them apart. The rules whispered in every glance, every slight, every carefully guarded step. It was ironic, even cruel, that he should stand so close and yet remain so profoundly unreachable. A slight stirring among the guests marked the arrival of dessert, and Marianne found herself momentarily jolted back to the present by a small voice at her side. "Miss Marianne, I trust your health this evening is well?" Thenick, a distant relation, with eyes that treasured gossip like gold. Marianne responded with polite warmth, careful to keep her tone neutral, deflecting the probing curiosity that seemed to shimmer beneath the older woman's words. "Yes, quite well, thank you." "And how do you find the season so far?" Marianne asked, gathering her poise. "Mrs. Messi." Fenwick's smile was tight, the slightest wrinkle of expectation curling about her lips. "Oh, as lively as always, though one would hope for some fresh intrigue. The society grows ever tiresome when all the same faces dominate." Marianne suppressed a sigh, recognizing the subtle allusion. The fresh intrigue meant scandal, or at least something to shatter the brittle monotony of their social dance. The Viscount, of course, was a constant subject of whispered speculation, but none dared approach the core of their unspoken connection. As she fought to stay present, her eyes again found the Viscount's across the room. This time, his gaze held a flicker of something that might have been hope, or perhaps a plea. Marianne's pulse surged with an ache that was both exhilarating and terrifying. She clenched her hands beneath the table, the strength of her restraint tested anew. What was forbidden between them was not merely the affection simmering beneath layers of civility, but the very daring to hope for something more. The Viscount shifted, accepting a glass of port from a footman, and as he raised it slightly in her direction, the faintest curve touched his lips, a ghost of a smile that vanished almost before it could be seen. Marianne could not say if the smile had been meant for her or only a trick of the light. But in that fleeting moment, amid the clatter of silverware and measured conversation, she felt as though a quiet accord had been reached, not spoken aloud, but etched in the spaces between them, in the undercurrent of the evening's disciplined performance. The unyielding walls of propriety remained, yet beneath them a fragile and forbidden current stirred, promising change in a world all too steadfast in its refusal to acknowledge anything beyond reputation and restraint. The cold weight of whispers haunted Marianne's reputation more thoroughly than any spoken accusation ever could. As the candles burned low in the polished halls of Almack's, the murmurs flitted like restless shadows, gathering strength with every soft step and sideways glance. The great pavilion, packed with society's most polished faces and silks, seemed to shrink beneath the oppressive force of gossip. Marianne felt it coil and constrict around her like a snare, tightening in cruel increments with each breath she took. Her family had long been the subject of hushed suspicion, but tonight that suspicion blossomed into something sharper, a pointed accusation that threatened to unravel not just her prospects, but the fragile dignity she so carefully guarded. Somewhere behind her, a cluster of bonneted women exchanged curt nods, their eyes flickering with disdain wrapped carefully in genteel smiles. They whispered of impropriety, murmuring of debts unpaid, of scandalous messengers seen slipping discreetly in and out of townhouses past dark, and a faint hint at least one gentleman rendered less than reputable, if not outright disreputable, by association. "Quite the predicament for Miss Marianne, isn't it?" a voice said, low and seeded with venom. "Certes, subtly disconcern. Such a shame for one so well promising." Marianne tightened the grip of her fan, her delicate fingers raw beneath layers of lace. She felt a blush rise, but it was not born of shame. It was anger, the slow, simmering type that required every ounce of her composure to keep from spilling over. No, she would not give these whispers fuel, not here, not before them all. But just as she summoned the fortitude to step quietly away, the murmur of conversation was abruptly cut by a new sound, firm clipped footsteps echoing into the room with an uncommon confidence. The air shifted, heads turned. Marianne knew the moment before she saw him. The Viscount, he stood tall and still where the marble floor caught the light, the polished buttons of his coat gleaming like a beacon against the refined gloom. His eyes, steely and sharp, searched the crowd with a look that brooked no opposition. The mole near his cheekbone caught the light, a stark contrast to the shadow that had settled beneath his gaze. His presence was a disruption, unexpected, unwelcome to many. Whispers abruptly ceased as the room subtly tilted its focus towards him. The Viscount's reputation, as a man proud to walk a lonely road of personal torment and social aloofness, made his entrance into a gathering like this startling enough. His choice to arrive not merely as a guest, but as a champion, shattered the careful balance of Almack's circle. He moved with quiet certainty toward the group that had spoken of her. His voice, when he spoke, was low but clear, pressing over the gathered assembly like the tide insistently pushing at a cliff face. "It's unfortunate, and somewhat unbecoming, to spread baseless conjecture, particularly where a lady's honour is concerned." His eyes locked confidently on the ringleader of the whisperers, a woman well versed in the art of society's petty cruelties. Miss Marianne is known to me as a woman of integrity and with a steadfast character. It is not my place to elucidate private family matters, but whatever improprieties may be suggested, I assure you, none can be attributed to her conduct. A hush fell, punctuated by the faint clinks of crystal and murmured disapproval. Some heads tilted, curiosity threading through suspicion, others staring at him as if seeing for the first time a glimmer of something long concealed beneath his reserved exterior. Marianne felt a brief, disbelieving flush of warmth crawl across her cheeks. The Viscount's defence was more than unexpected. It was a bold declaration, an act of recklessness that bordered on scandal itself, in a room that thrived on control. Yet beneath the flamboyance lay something more profound. He had acknowledged her in the face of social menace, a gesture subtle in words but radical in implication. She dared to meet his eyes for a moment. His gaze did not waver. In that short exchange, a fragile alliance was forged in the quiet rebellion of one man's loyalty against the pervasive sting of public shame. The Viscount gave her more than words. He gifted her a shield forged of respect and quiet resolve. The evening drew on, but Marianne's world had shifted. Though the complicated dance of propriety and pretense wore on around them, beneath the surface she knew, whatever the cost, she was no longer alone in the silent battle that mattered most. Late that night, behind closed doors, scented faintly with lavender and warmed by the soft firelight, Marianne reached for her pen with a trembling hand. The veneer of formality she wore during the day peeled away when she sat alone with paper and ink. There, only truth could survive. She poured herself into her writing, as though the act itself might steady the fragile thread tethering her to hope. The letter she composed was a careful rebuke, softened by gratitude, an opening to a correspondence wrought from vulnerability. "My lord," she began, her script neat but earnest, "I find myself compelled to thank you for your unlooked-for defence this evening. Your words steadied me in a way I scarce thought possible amidst such a tempest of reproach. I should not presume to ask your forbearance once more, yet I must confess that your kindness kindled a wish to understand you beyond the veil of society's expectations." She paused. The quill poised mid-air as her thoughts trembled on an edge between confession and restraint. "I, too, carry burdens. Others rarely see the scars of guardians, betrayals that twist like shadows at the edges of every hope. Though the world insists we temper our truths, I wonder if in candour there may be solace." Her hand faltered, then steadied. "I hope, if you would care to, you might share the truths you hide, that we might offer each other the refuge of genuine trust, where faces are veils and smiles rights," signing as simply M. She folded the letter with an intimacy she withheld in the daylight, then sealed it with pale wax. Some nights later, a reply arrived, bearing the unmistakable seal of the Viscount. She broke the wax with fingers that shook, revealing not just words, but a fragment of the man himself, written in ink, an unspoken hope. "My dearest M," the letter began, the sharp hand that penned it softened by sentiment, "your courage in reaching out shames me not a little, though it grants me a reprieve from the silent jail of my own making." He confessed to mistakes, failures that had haunted his conscience and haunted the quiet hours of his night. The scars he revealed were not visible, but etched deeper still in remorse and regret, shadows he carried not to seek pity, but to explain the withheld heart she glimpsed only on rare, flickering occasions. "I have lived long with the weight of my own failings and the cold taste of lost opportunities for redemption. Yet your words, set against the unyielding constrictions of our worlds, offer a light glimpse of a truth that may yet be mine, that beneath the masks we bear, the heart demands to be known." Their letters became a secret current, flowing between Marianne's guarded tenderness and the Viscount's wary but growing revelation. Paper became a sanctuary, where masks fell and true selves intertwined. In one letter, Marianne wrote of the ache left by familial treachery, how the very blood that should have sheltered her had sometimes left her exposed to the harshest judgments. "You must know," she penned one night, "that my scar, subtle though it appears, is more than skin. It is a reminder that those closest can betray with a knife far sharper than any stranger's tongue." The Viscount replied with solemn understanding, sharing fragments of a childhood uprooted by tragedy, a brother lost to reckless indulgence, and a father's furious disappointment, is a testament to the depth of his pain, fierce but hidden, like embers beneath cold ash. As the weeks unfolded into months, the letters wove a delicate tapestry of shared truths and quiet hope. Each inked phrase brought them closer across the distance of society's harsh demands, steadying Marianne's fragile courage and rekindling the Viscount's own shattered faith in connection. Their correspondence, once a cautious thread, blossomed into a lifeline, a secret world where the heart's whispered confessions defied the constrictions of reputation. It carried them both beyond the rigid walls of decorum into a realm where love, with all its perils and promises, could dare to breathe. The sharp edges of springtime seemed to harden wherever Marianne's aunt crossed her path that day, as if the very air conspired to betray the fragile warmth that had been blossoming between her and the Viscount. The moment Marianne returned to the great drawing-room of Redhall House, the weight of the heavy velvet curtains and the taciturn countenances of the portrait-lined walls pressed down upon her like a cold vice. Her heart beat unevenly as Aunt Eleanor, every inch the embodiment of Regency severity and propriety, sat stiffly by the fire with folding hands, eyes narrowed as if to intimidate. The faint scent of lavender that usually accompanied her aunt's presence was altogether absent, replaced by the musty chill of disapproval. "Marianne," Aunt Eleanor's voice was clipped and purposeful, the eloquence of her words sharpened by a will of iron. "I assure you that you have been engaging in a most imprudent and unbecoming correspondence with the Viscount." She paused, allowing the accusation to settle like a stone in Marianne's chest. "Do you understand the peril in which you place yourself? The scandal, the ruin, not just for you, but for your family. Name." Marianne's breath caught. The letters, the sanctuary she had nurtured in secret, were no longer hers alone. They had become weapons in a war waged by gossip and suspicion, broad daylight prying at the hidden spaces where her heart found solace. "I am well aware of the stakes, Aunt Eleanor," Marianne said, voice steadier than she expected, "but these letters, they are not merely idle folly. They are the only thread of kindness I have known these past months." Aunt Eleanor's mouth thinned, her eyes hardening like the winter frost shimmering on distant moorlands. "Kindness, my dear, is no defence against the judgment of society. The Viscount is a man of station, but his family history is not a mark against his character." Marianne interrupted, the boldness rising unexpectedly within her. "Nor do I believe I am beholden to the prejudices of others who would see me caged by half-truths." Her aunt's gaze slid to the delicate scar at Marianne's temple, a visible testament as unwelcome to society as the whispered opinions that dogged their line. "You are young, frivolous even, and you put your heart in dangerous places. I forbid you from writing to him or receiving his letters. Does that not make clear your duty to your family?" Marianne met her aunt's glare for another heartbeat before her lips pressed into a firm line. "I will not promise what I cannot in my conscience accept, Aunt Eleanor. Then you will bring shame upon us all." The words were as exacting as winter's bite, and with a faint but resolute clack of her fan, Aunt Eleanor rose, leaving a corridor of cold silence behind her. Marianne remained rooted, cool flames of defiance flickering in her chest, even as doubt pressed close. The room seemed to constrict, the tapestry on the wall suddenly foreign, the heavy furniture as daunting as the expectations she had never dared to defy before. She crossed the room slowly to her writing desk. The letters she had kept locked away in a crimson silk pouch trembling faintly beneath her fingertips. Could she deny herself the only warmth these missives had ever granted? The Viscount's ink told stories her lips never dared whisper aloud, affirming a hope she could barely grasp, but fiercely longed to nurture. The house was hushed, now the whispers of servants like distant echoes of judgment. Yet Marianne felt no peace in compliance, no relief in giving up the fragile thread of connection. Her fingers trembled as she penned a single line beneath the flickering candlelight, words as much for herself as for him. I cannot sever what has already taken root in my soul. Yet even as she sealed the letter, a tremor of fear hummed beneath her resolve, a warning that defiance might bear consequences she was not yet prepared to face. The quiet countryside air of Rosewood Estate carried the hum of spring blossoms and the familiar stirrings of society's dance laughter spilling from French windows, the clipped steps of ladies and gentlemen alike, weaving intricate patterns on manicured lawns. Marianne had come as a reluctant guest of distant relations, the polite necessity of such gatherings pressing against her with all the weight of expectation. Yet, amidst the finely wrought ballrooms and polite parlours, she found herself stealing away from the clamour, drawn toward the rough-hewn cliff paths overlooking the restless sea. The wind was brisk, teasing out soft curls at her temple and setting the ribbons of her bonnet adrift like whispers. Beneath the endless expanse of grey-blue sky, the scent of salt and wild grass mingled in intoxicating freedom, far from the suffocating gaze of family and fortune. She heard footsteps long before they reached her, the measured stride, familiar as a heartbeat, steady and sure. The Viscount emerged from the shadow of twisting hawthorns, the grey of his eyes matching the churning waves below. He bore the visible weariness of a man burdened by secrets and responsibilities, too vast for his lean shoulders, yet when he smiled, a slow, quiet lift of the corner of his mouth, the world seemed to soften, and the formality slipped away between them, leaving only the warmth of shared space. They began to walk together along the precipice, the path twisting among gorse and bracken, the sea roaring below as a constant witness. The salt wind tangled in her hair, and she stole a glance at him, noting how the fading light cast shadows that deepened the hollow at his temples and the faint furrow between his brows. "It is rare," he said after a moment, voice softer now, "to find a place where one can simply be." Her thoughts gathering like wild birds on the breeze. "It is perilous to linger too long in such freedom," she murmured. "Society, its eyes, its tongues, they never rest." His gaze lingered on the far horizon before settling back on her. "I have come to learn that the walls we build around ourselves often serve as prisons as much as protection." He paused, the faintest tremor in his voice. "You have seen them, haven't you?" "The flaws I keep hidden." Marianne's heart leapt, uncertain if she was ready to unveil the truth she had only felt in the spaces between his words. "Only hints," she admitted, "but I know courage when I see it." He smiled then, a shadowed smile, before the corners of his eyes tightened in vulnerability. "My temper has been a ruinous tempest, breaking against those I care for most. The bitterness of loss has hardened me beyond what I pretend to share. I fear I am not the man you imagine, Marianne, but a fractured soul masking bruises far deeper than any scar." She reached out, her gloved hand brushing lightly against his. "None of us are untouched by pain," she said gently. "It is not perfection I seek, but truth. And you have shown me yours, in words and silences both." He looked down at their hands, the contact sparking warmth despite the chill wind. You make even the bitter taste of my failings seem bearable. Her breath caught at the intimacy of the confession, the rare glimpse beneath the armor he'd so carefully donned. Around them, the sky grew heavy with the promise of twilight, streaks of rose and amber melting into storm grey. The weight of society's demands loomed always at the edge of this moment, harsh voices and cruel speculation ready to pounce, eager to unravel their fragile thread. But in this space between crashing waves and wind-bent hedgerows, Marianne realized with a nearly painful clarity that trust was the greatest rebellion of all. "Promise me," she said softly, "that if we are to brave what comes next, we will be honest, no more walls." His gaze locked with hers. The vulnerability exchanged as profound as a whispered vow. "Honesty," he agreed, "even when it frightens us." For a time, words were unnecessary. They walked on, side by side, the vastness of the sea spreading endlessly before them, its turbulent beauty a mirror to the storm of possibility and peril that bound their souls together. And beneath the cold bracing wind and the solemn sky, two hearts dared to beat in reckless harmony against the unyielding tide of the world. The grand drawing-room of Lady Marchmont's estate was alive with murmurs beneath the gilded chandeliers, whispers that rippled like wildfire through the sea of assembled gowns and waistcoats. The crystal clink of glasses and the soft rustle of silk blended into a haze of perfumed breath and polite laughter. Yet beneath it all, a single unwelcome truth was about to rend the delicate veil of propriety. Marianne sat near the lattice window, the pale light of the gas lamps casting long shadows across her face, the youthful softness there now marred by an expression harder than she cared to admit. The letters she had received, each one from him, had always been hidden beneath the folds of her hectic days, notes of whispered affection and quiet confession. But one, that same morning, had been wrenched from the sanctity of secrecy by the cruel hand of fate. She had hoped the scandal might spare her father's fragile pride, spare her mother's silent prayers for discretion. The room's attention shifted as a hush fell, a sudden silence that more properly resembled the breath held before a storm. "I must confess," Lord Seaton's voice rang sharp and cutting, "that the contents of this most unruly epistle have been presented to me quite by accident." His cocked brow and the faint curl of his lip challenged the crowd's collective decorum. Marianne caught her breath. His presence near the tall pedestal pulpit was no accident. The Viscount, tall and austere even in the midst of scandal, stood with the air of one condemned rather than defending. His sharp grey eyes, usually so guarded, glanced but briefly toward her, shadowed now with a quiet melancholy that seemed to stem from a bone-deep place. Lord Seaton unfolded the letter with a practised ceremoniousness and raised his voice, clear and steady, to the gathering that had gathered like wasps around the honeycomb of society's disgrace. "To my dearest Marianne," he read aloud, the tone dripping with deliberate reproach as eyes grew wide and lips twitched behind lace fans. "Your disdain a blade, yet, even in this coldness, my heart beats stubborn and true. I do not ask for your pardon, but for your trust, that which has been denied to me for too long." He let the letter hang in the stale air like a guillotine's blade, knowing full well the storm it would provoke. Gasps and murmurs spread like wildfire. Lady Beatrice Arden covered her mouth in shock, her sapphire eyes blazing with scandalous delight, while Lord Pembroke's usual hauteur wavered with confusion. Marianne's own fingers clenched into the fabric of her dress as the weight of all those judgments bore down upon her. The elegant web of appearances, the careful balance she had fought so hard to maintain, was fracturing before her eyes. What folly, Lady Marchmont hissed beside her in barely disguised contempt. To think a gentlewoman should scandal herself with letters so improper, so unseemly. But she forced her lips into a mask of composed calm. Her voice was but a whisper, brittle with pain, but unbroken. "I have done no folly beyond feeling." Voices surged in response, accusations wrapped in veiled threats. A kinship of whispered condemnations wove around her, fingers pointed, reputations assailed behind silken veils. The assembly, ever hungry for spectacle, feasted on her disgrace. As the murmurs swelled, the Viscount's figure receded, not with the menacing swagger of a scorned lover, but with the quiet dignity of a man reduced to ruins. When the toast was finally lifted, it was not in celebration, but in a reluctant admission of shattered respect. The scorn flung at Marianne was double-edged, cutting as sharply as any landed insult she had faced, while the Viscount bore the brunt of the public censure with a stoicism that was as heart-breaking as it was infuriating. She longed to cradle the fragments of their love before the world tore them asunder, but instead could only hide behind a veneer of respectability that felt thinner than ever. Later, in the solitary refuge of her chamber, the heavy oak door slammed shut behind her. The dim candlelight flickered on the embroidered gown that clung to her slender form, shadows dancing across the scar near her temple as if mocking her resolve. With trembling fingers, she pulled another letter from the drawer, the latest missive, those dangerously tender words, penned with care and hope, and yet again she could not bring herself to open it. Her heart pounded fiercely, the ache of denial settling deep in her chest. Each unopened letter was a wound she inflicted upon herself, a measured attempt to shield from the ruthless claws of gossip, but also a desperate act to preserve the fragile fragments of hope swelling inside. Why did the heart betray, reason so utterly? The letters called to her whispered promises and imperfect, beautiful truths that demanded reckoning. She pressed the unopened envelope to her lips, seeking some solace in the weight of the paper, the intimacy of forbidden words still hidden from her eyes. How to reconcile the woman who wished for love and the woman society demanded she be? Scorned, penniless by association, bound by obligation to a family whose shadow clung to her every step, each day did little to dull the sting. If anything, it sharpened her resolve. Clad in the austerity of solitude, Marianne wiped away a tear. She refused even as a concession. She was more than whispers and clandestine correspondences. More than the sum of her father's debts and her mother's fainting spells at ill-timed rumours, she would prove it. Not by defiance in the streets or whispered scandals returned in kind, but by carving out for herself a place where her worth was measured by wit, by courage, by a quiet tenacity that no society ball or whispered outrage could undo. Listen, she thought, the night presses close, yet my skin has been made fierce from its winter winds. Let the world talk, I shall write my own story, one penned not by whispered malice, but by hands that dare to hold truth with both trembling and fierce grace. Marianne sat back, the unopened letters still in her lap, and felt the slow, steady rise of something fierce within, a fire to be more, to be whole, despite the world's cruel and narrow gaze. She would not surrender. The late afternoon sun filtered through the tall mullioned windows of the old library at Greywick Hall, casting long ribbons of honeyed light onto the worn leather spines that stretched from floor to ceiling. The scent of aged oak and faint smoke from the dying hearth wrapped around the room like a secret kept close. The Viscount stood by a heavy carved writing desk, the silence between them thick and raw. Marianne's heart beat unevenly. A wild thing caged too long, she shifted her gaze away from a row of dusty tomes. fixing on the narrowed silver slivers of light instead. The weight of the locked door behind them pressed upon her, a quiet guard against prying ears, against the stifling eyes of a society that judged too harshly, too quickly. Here, in the safety and solemnity of knowledge and shadows, the Viscount at last lowered the wall he had built as resolutely as the estate's stone walls. "You came," he said, voice low, but remarkably steady. It was a statement, a relief, a question tangled into one. Marianne swallowed the knot in her throat. "I could not refuse," she whispered, the words almost foreign, fragile as spun glass, but hardening with resolve. "But you must understand, my silence is not contempt. It is caution," he nodded, stepping closer, lowering his voice further, until the words felt like shared breath. "I ask not for blind trust, Marianne, only a chance to reveal truths that shadows have long kept hidden." Her eyes lifted toward his, sharp grey meeting hazel, searching for some flicker beyond the melancholy. The Viscount drew a slow breath, as if bracing against unseen memories. "There are stains upon my family that have nothing to do with misdeeds, but rather with misfortune and cold suspicion. My father," his voice faltered, "he was cruelly betrayed by one he once called kin, a betrayal that shattered not only trust, but legacy itself. Had it been mere rumour, I might ignore it. But the truth, sordid and tangled, has been my inheritance." Marianne's fingers tightened around the edges of her gloves. She had heard whispers, scandal encrypted, in the veiled glances exchanged at gallery viewings. Words like duel and disgrace had danced dangerously close, but never dared speak plainly. Now here, this man, this wounded Viscount, dared to pull away the curtain. "Tell me," she dared, "if you would." His eyes darkened, as if dredging from some deep well of anguish. "My brother, my only brother." Whether truly guilty or not, no evidence was ever permitted a fair hearing, for the alliances that turned against him were powerful. The crown of a corrupt court fell upon my family, dragging us through shame and exile. My own acceptance into society has been coloured by the sins of blood, though I bear no scar but those carved by suspicion and whispers. Marianne's breath caught, the complexity of his confession suffusing the room with an ache she hadn't expected. Never had she imagined the pride so carefully displayed could mask such raw torment. She saw now, beneath the worn elegance and heavy expectations, a man fractured and isolated, not unlike herself. "Are you redeemed?" she asked, shakily, searching his face as if for a sign. He offered a thin, world-weary smile. "I hope to be. But redemption is not a gift. It is a hard-won ground, trampled underfoot by doubts and the ever-watchful eyes of society." A silence settled, tender and tentative, as if both were suspended in a moment between past wounds and possible futures. Eyes alight with a passion both fierce and fragile. "I wrote them because I believe what we might build, however slowly and carefully, that is worth every risk." Marianne's heart trembled with the truth she had braced against. She thought of every unopened envelope folded so delicately and, until this moment, unused. The promise embedded in those unseen words burned unexpectedly bright. "I will not pretend the path will be easy. But I ask you, will you take this wretched, beautiful chance?" His voice softened to a whisper. "Will you trust me, Marianne?" For an instant, time itself held its breath. The tangle of her longing tangled with every societal fetter, every cautious instinct built from years of wary living. Yet here, standing amidst the silence of centuries of stories contained within these walls, the fragile seed of something wild and true took root. Slowly she stepped forward, her voice steady and sure. "I will. The Viscount's grey eyes flickered with relief, and he reached out, hesitating only a moment before taking her gloved hand in his own. The contact was feather-light but electrifying, a silent vow whispered between two souls, long burdened by solitude. Outside the locked door, the world might rage with whispered scandal or cold expectation, but here, in this small sanctuary, something neither could name, but both could feel, had begun. That night the wind howled fiercely around Greywick Hall, but inside the Viscount's library the storm settled softly, carried away on the wings of fragile trust and whispered promises. Asterisk, 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 asterisk. Days passed in a dizzy blur of clandestine meetings. Each stolen moment bit from the sacred time Marianne reserved for herself felt like both a gift and a dangerous gamble. Her aunt's chilling warnings echoed faintly in the back of her mind. A steady heartbeat of caution, yet something fierce and new, stoked a fire that defied prudence. The spring season was awakening in London, budding magnolias decorating the thoroughfares, the air thick with the scent of fresh rain and anticipation, and with it came invitations laced with duty and dread. The pivotal ball, the grand event of the season, loomed near. To attend without her aunt's sanction was to invite calamity. Yet the Viscount's letter, delivered with a mixture of formality and concealed yearning, bore a singular, undiminished invitation. "Dance with me at the ball." Marianne's chest tightened at the thought, and, to be seen in the whirl of gowns, candle light glinting off fans and diamonds, with the Viscount, the man society had deemed sullied, was a public declaration that danced on the edge of daring disaster. But oh, how the heart wrenched for it! On the night of the ball, Marianne slipped quietly from the austere confines of Greywick Hall. Her aunt's sharp eyes were elsewhere, distracted by the restless chatter of her own soirée and the relentless clatter of whispered judgments. Wearing a gown soft as moonlight and powdered in the faintest blush of surrender, Marianne caught her breath before passing beneath the glittering chandelier and into the electric hum of the ballroom. Every step felt precarious, threading between expectation and rebellion, yet as the Viscount's eyes found hers across the crowded room, a quiet defiance bloomed within her chest. He approached, a small, almost hesitant bow, his gaze a tempest of respect and longing. From the folds of his dark robe he withdrew a delicate white glove, offering his hand with a silent request that rippled amongst the watching crowd like a stone cast into glassy water. Marianne curtsied, the briefest dip that spoke volumes, acknowledgment, trust, and a rebellion dressed in grace. The room's breath caught a tidal wave of whispers trailing behind her like silk. "She defies her aunt." Asterisk, asterisk. The Viscount's shadowed companion. Asterisk, asterisk. Bravery or folly? She lifted her gaze unabashedly to the Viscount's face, where melancholy had softened into something fierce and unyielding. "May I?" he murmured. The simple words, a key unlocking a door she dared no longer keep closed. Her fingers brushed his as she slipped into his arm, a touch, electric yet steady. The music swelled strings, weaving through the golden air, and together they moved, the first notes of the dance binding them in a fragile promise. Around them the ballroom blurred into a hazy sea of glances and gasps, but Marianne felt only the steady beat of his heart close to hers, and the rush of windswept tides within her blood, wild, untamable, and finally hers to claim. With every step, with every turn beneath the glittering chandeliers, she felt the chains of fear fall away, replaced by the quiet strength of defiance and the tender hope of trust. The Viscount's hand at her waist was steady, a lifeline pulled through the tangle of scorn and secrets. The whispered surprise of the ton so dangerous, so intoxicating only sharpened the fire blazing quietly beneath her skin. Tonight, Marianne was no one's shadow, no one's whispered scandal. Tonight she was whole. And if the world dared to speak, she would answer with the certainty of this dance, this moment, this burgeoning love, spoken not in letters hidden and unopened, but in the irrefutable language of heartbeats aligned. The ball carried on in incandescent waves, but for Marianne and the Viscount, time folded tenderly around them, holding safe the fragile truth that sometimes love's purest power lies in the courage to be seen. And so, beneath the flickering glow of crystal and candlelight, two souls, scarred, guarded, and fiercely hopeful, wove a story begun in silence, shaped by trust and destined to whisper through the ages. As their feet glided across the polished floor, the orchestra's delicate strains weaving a tapestry of lilting melodies, the whispering tide of society closed around them like a gathering storm. Around the fringes of the ballroom, delicate fans fluttered with barely concealed curiosity, noses lifted in subtle but unmistakable suspicion. Eyes once indifferent, or indifferent no longer, peeled toward them with varying shades of disbelief and calculated disappointment. Some whispered with scandal-laden tones, others smiled thinly, dry as dust, as though their amusement was a salve to soothe wounded pride or bruised expectation. Yet, amidst the cool glare of scrutiny and the pointed dance of judgment, Marianne met every glance, every muttered word, every flicker of disdain, with the serene, unshakable poise of a woman who had weathered far darker storms. She held her head high, the soft curls capturing the glow of chandeliers overhead, her hazel eyes serene pools of quiet defiance. The scar at her temple, the one she had once wished to hide, now seemed like a silent, fierce emblem of survival, etched delicately into her very being. She was no fragile bloom, trembling in the frost of society's frowns. Rather, she was a rare rose left to blossom in the winter, resolute, unyielding. Beside her, the Viscount's gaze was a constant tether-anchored, measured, but beneath its cool veneer it burned with admiration and something deeper, more tender. He counted the shadows of gossip as one might tally the falling leaves on an autumn afternoon. Each whispered slight, each hostile glance, each sideways murmur was noted with a quiet, almost protective intensity. But what captivated him most was Marianne's strength, the unspoken forgiveness in her smile, the refusal to shrink away, the way she claimed this moment, this dance, this defiant union of two unlikely souls who dared to break their prescribed roles. He could feel her resolve pressed gently against the fragile bones of his own, steadying him in a world so often fractured by scandal and secrets. The music swelled in waves, their bodies moving with ease and grace, an intimate choreography that belonged to them and no one else. Though the stifling weight of society pressed in relentlessly, it could not obscure the radiant light that glimmered between them, a light born of trust, stitched gradually through letters, stolen moments, and now this audacious declaration before an unforgiving crowd. The Viscount's breath was steady but shallow. He savoured the warmth radiating from Marianne, the way her fingers curved naturally within his own, strong yet trembling ever so slightly with the fierceness of her emotions. His heart, once burdened by an unworthy past and the cruel whisper of imperfections, now beat with the tentative hope of a future rewritten. Each turn of their dance carried the silent promise of defiance spoken softly beneath the glitter of chandeliers. Here, in this careful, breathtaking waltz, they existed beyond the reach of idle tongues and cold judgments. When the final notes faded into the hushed reverence of the room, Marianne's lips curved in a soft, knowing smile, not one of victory or resentment, but that gentle triumph born only of surviving and daring to hope. Together they bowed to the assembled assembly, the murmurs unabated but softened by their undeniable presence, and then slipped from the ballroom's hold like shadows melting into moonlight. Outside, the cold night air was a crisp balm, sharp and pure. The sky was a canvas of ink and scattered stars, blinking distant and indifferent to the petty concerns below. The grand house behind them hummed with muffled laughter and clinking glasses, the life of the ball still thundering within, but Marianne's thoughts were elsewhere, heavy with the tides of what might come and what had already been lost. With a quiet breath, she slipped through the dim corridor toward the library, her footsteps muffled against thick carpets, away from the persistent gaze of society's watchful eyes. The weight on her chest, a mixture of fear, regret, and longing, deepened with each step. The room was cool and shadowed, lined with rows of leather-bound volumes, their spines embossed gold and faded from years of careful indulgence. Here, amongst the whispered wisdom of the past, she found space to breathe, to truly be. The Viscount's presence came with no fanfare, just the gentle sound of footsteps, deliberate and unhurried. She did not need to turn, but the quiet strength of his company steadied something fragile within her. His voice broke the silence, low and raw, with a vulnerability he had long concealed beneath layers of reserve. He held the letter in his hand crisp, folded with care. The envelope creased from being read and re-read countless times. "I suppose it was folly," he began, a faint, rueful smile tugging at his mouth. "To believe that words on paper, no matter how earnest, could bridge the gulf between us, when you could not bear to read them." Marianne's fingers clenched at her side. The truth stung sharper than she had expected. "I was afraid," she admitted softly, her voice barely above a whisper, "afraid of what I might find, and even more, afraid of what I might lose if I let you in." The Viscount stepped closer, the flickering candlelight casting shadows across his sharp features, highlighting the mole near his cheekbone, the grey depths of his eyes brimming with emotion. "Then, perhaps it is time you hear these words aloud. Not as mere letters, but as the beating of a heart that waited, day after day, for a chance to be seen." His voice trembled slightly, not with fear, but with the aching hope of a man unshielded for once. He began to read, the cadence of his